The relations between Turkey and Saudi Arabia are now becoming a subject of interest following the alleged killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a critic of Riyadh's current government, in his country's consulate in Istanbul. To better understand this event and its consequences, it is necessary to put in the broader context the bilateral relations between the two states, which dates back to the 1920s. Once the main power in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled in both political and territorial terms in the wake of its defeat in World War I, thus reshaping the region's geopolitical order. Many of its former lands became de facto colonies under the rule of either Great Britain or France on the basis of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But two cases stand out as exceptions: the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of Turkey. During the Great War, Britain was fighting against the Ottoman Empire, who was allied with Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. In this context, the British were actively supporting an Arab uprising to weaken the Ottomans and extend their influence on the Middle East. This led to a deal with the Saud family. In exchange of aid against the Ottomans, the House of Saud would rule an independent kingdom after the end of the war. This resulted in the establishment of Saudi Arabia, which takes its name from the ruling Al Saud dynasty in 1932. An important aspect of the newborn state was its affiliation to Wahhabism, a conservative interpretation of Islam that became the basis of the Saudi political system. This made the kingdom the champions of Sunni Islam, even though its adherence to Wahhabism has recently become less marked under the influence of Crown Prince Salman. After the discovery of huge oil reserves in the 1930s, Saudi Arabia gradually became a major producer and started accumulating wealth. During the Cold War, it forged an alliance with the United States, thus becoming, in spite of occasional divergences like the 1973 oil crisis, one of its main allies in the Middle East. As of today, the House of Saud is still in power, and its cooperation with the US remains a central element of its foreign policy. For its part, the Ottoman Empire was weakened by war, politically delegitimized and in social unrest, and had to face the consequences of defeat. With the nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk gaining more and more influence, the caliphate did not last. The last caliph was deposed and a republic was proclaimed. But its territory was much smaller than the pre-war empire. Other than Iraq, Syria, Palestine and Arabia, it even lost some lands in mainland Anatolia, which it recovered after a war with Greece in 1919 to 1922, that gave the country its current shape. Ataturk promoted westernization in the newly born republic, notably to transform it into a secular state after centuries of religious-based Ottoman rule. This is a major difference from Saudi Arabia, which instead based its polity upon religious conservatism. But like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Turkey decided to side with America after World War II, joining NATO in 1952. During the decades, the country experienced several coups, the last of which occurred in 2016 as an attempt to overthrow President Erdogan, who has held the office since 2014 after serving 11 years as Prime Minister. Official relations between the two countries were established in 1932 when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was founded. During the pre-World War II era, when the Middle East was still largely influenced by European powers, their bilateral relations were stable and no major issues emerged. During the late 40s, following the withdrawal of colonial forces, new states appeared in the region and started pursuing their own geopolitical objectives, thus complicating the regional dynamics. A first factor of disagreement was the Palestinian issue and the creation of Israel. Turkey recognized the Zionist state and adopted a moderate stance towards it during the Arab-Israeli wars, whereas Saudi Arabia refused to establish official relations with it and actively supported the cause of Palestinians as well as that of Arab states fighting against Israel. Relations with Iran would soon become another problematic issue. Before the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic, Ankara maintained good relations with Tehran. The instauration of the new Iranian regime resulted into colder relations for some time due to Turkey's friendly ties with the US and Israel, but then they gradually improved. Prior to the Islamic Revolution, Riyadh also enjoyed general positive relations with Tehran, with the two main points of disagreement being religious divides, Sunni versus Shia respectively, and the recognition of Israel by the former. But this dramatically changed after 1979. The difference in faith combined with Saudi's amity with the US turned their mutual relations into strong hostility. The Iran-Iraq war that raged between 1980 and 1988 saw the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Turkey taking a different stance. Riyadh, in spite of strained relations with Baghdad, considered Tehran's revolutionary regime to be the main threat to its security and therefore supported the former with financial aid. In contrast, Turkey was more conciliatory with Iran. Keeping a neutralist policy, it maintained economic ties with both belligerents, thus refusing to implement the US-led embargo on Iran. The outbreak of the Gulf War in 1991 following Iraq's occupation of Kuwait saw both Saudi Arabia and Turkey joining the US-guided coalition against Iraq. Ankara and Riyadh also took different postures after the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq by US forces. The fact that most of the terrorists that had hijacked the planes used to strike the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were Saudi nationals caused some strain between Riyadh and Washington, but in general the Saudis cooperated with the US in the war on terror. On its part, Turkey supported the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 but opposed that of Iraq in 2003 out of fears that the instability that would follow the end of Saddam's regime would allow the Iraqi Kurds to obtain an independent state. The year 2011 can be seen as a turning point in the history of contemporary Middle East, and the events that took place since then had a profound effect on Turkish-Saudi relations. In 2011, the Arab Spring shook the region, leading to the outbreak of a bloody and still unresolved civil war in Syria. The US withdrew its last combat forces from Iraq and reduced its direct involvement in the Middle East in accordance with President Obama's leading from behind policy. Since then, the region's geopolitical landscape has significantly changed and local actors have become more active. Both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have supported the rebels trying to topple the al-Assad regime in Syria. The two also found some common ground in the fight against the auto-proclaimed Islamic State. In 2014, this militant group rapidly seized control of considerable swaths of territory in the northern parts of Iraq and Syria. An international coalition started hitting its position with airstrikes to support the local forces on the ground. Both Saudi Arabia and Turkey have condemned the group, even though there have been allegations that wealthy Saudi nationals founded the group and that Turkey has secretly traded oil with it. The struggle against the IS also explains why both have sustained the Iraqi state, even though their involvement responds to a slightly different logic. Ankara did so to avoid that a Kurdish state may emerge from the fragmentation of Iraq, plus to prevent that Tehran may complete a pipeline that would allow it to export its hydrocarbons without having to pass via the Turkish territory. On the other hand, Riyadh acted to limit Tehran's influence in the area, given that Iraq's population is mainly Shia. Also, in the frame of the Iran-Saudi proxy war in Yemen, the two powers are both helping the government forces to defeat the Houthi rebels sustained by Iran. Finally, the Saudis promptly expressed their support for Erdogan's government during the 2016 coup attempt. Yet, in the broader struggle for influence over the Middle East, the divergences between Riyadh and Ankara have multiplied. First, there is some form of ideological divergence. Since Erdogan became president in 2014, he promoted a reintroduction of religious-based norms in Turkey, and many consider this as being contrary to the secular spirit that the Republic has had since its foundation by Ataturk. At the same time, Saudi Arabia moved in the opposite direction under the leadership of Prince bin Salman. Even though he centralized power similarly to Erdogan, he lifted many of the traditional limitations in many aspects of Saudi society. But beyond that, there is much realpolitik underneath. The two support opposing factions in Egypt. The Saudis favour the government led by General al-Sisi, whereas the Turks support the opposition forces, notably the Muslim Brotherhood. This is not a factor to neglect, because having a friendly government in Cairo makes easier to access to the Red Sea and its shipping lanes, an objective that Ankara is pursuing. In regards to Iran, Saudi maintains its long-standing hostile stance, whilst Turkey, in spite of the differences, has shown more willingness to cooperate with it and Russia in regard to Iraq and Syria. In turn, this is linked to their relations with Israel. Riyadh, considering that Tehran is the main regional rival of Tel Aviv, is unofficially but concretely establishing closer ties with the latter, all with Washington's patronage. The Trump administration has clearly shown its willingness to support both Saudi Arabia and Israel, so this comes with no surprise. At the same time, Turkey's ties with the Jewish state have been deteriorating during the past decade, notably since Erdogan became president in 2014. Israel does not appreciate Turkey's support for Islamic movements and for the Palestinian cause, something which recently led to a verbal escalation between Erdogan and Netanyahu. Plus, Tel Aviv does not see positively Ankara's closer ties with Tehran. The access to offshore gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean is another factor that is straining their bilateral relations. Israel is collaborating with Cyprus and Egypt to exploit these energy resources, whereas Turkey is asserting its rights in a quite aggressive manner against other players. In this context, Tel Aviv is also fostering closer ties with Athens, whose relations with Ankara are historically problematic. Lastly, there is the Qatar issue. In 2017, Saudi Arabia and other countries including Egypt initiated a blockade on the small Gulf state because of its friendly ties with Iran and for allegedly sponsoring terrorism, a move that Israel approved. Soon, Turkey showed its support to Qatar by providing economic aid and even by dispatching its troops. The result is that an informal yet tangible entente is forming between Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States and other powers to counter Turkey, which in turn is creating closer ties with Iran and Russia. The more recent events are to be interpreted in this context. The Saudi-Turkish standoff that is making the headlines in recent days is just the latest episode of the deteriorating ties between the two countries, but relations with other powers should be factored in as well. The Turkish authorities accuse the Saudis to have assassinated Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist known for its critic position towards the government in Riyadh at the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul. This has sparked a crisis between the two countries and has attracted much mediatic attention. One interesting thing to note is that Turkey has decided to exploit this occasion to free US pastor Andrew Brunson, who had been detained for 2 years over accusation of being involved in the failed 2016 coup attempt to overthrow Erdogan. It appears that Turkey is trying to exploit the Khashoggi affair to restore its ties with the US, which have been damaged in recent years due to various issues. First, this is due to Turkey's cooperation with Russia and Iran, combined with its growing enmity towards Saudi Arabia and Israel. Secondly, the US refusal to extradite Fethullah Gulen, a Turkish cleric that Ankara blames to be responsible for the 2016 coup attempt. This leads to the third factor, namely the imposition of US sanctions on Turkey, something that caused a considerable depreciation of its currency, the lira, putting the country's economy under stress and forcing it to take restrictive economic measures in the form of higher interest rates. A measure that is perceived to be necessary to stop the fall of the lira's value, but will damage Turkey's economy by adding pressure on its negative trade balance and on its external debt. As such, the timing of Andrew Brunson's liberation now appears both as a conciliatory act towards the US in the hope of having sanctions lifted and to restore better political ties, as well as an attempt to improve its international image, all whilst damaging Saudi Arabia's. It is another application of Turkey's traditional policy of tilting alternatively towards the US and then towards Russia and Iran, so to keep viable relations with all and maximise its own benefit. After a period where it built its ties with Washington's adversaries, it is therefore to be expected that Ankara will now seek a reconciliation, but this will likely be only partial. Still, the US-Saudi ties are indeed becoming more strained following the episode, but in the long term it is likely that mutual interests will prevail. What will happen next is yet to be seen, but it's certain that the complex power interplay in the Middle East will not end here. I'm Kasim, thanks for watching another KJ vid. We would like to especially thank our contributor Alex Gaguridis, who conducted the research and analysis for this video in collaboration with KJ Vids. Don't forget to support our crowdfunding campaign on fundmypage.com or join our Patreon program where you can get perks for our content. You can also browse our book collection on our website kjvids.co.uk. Finally, if you would like to sponsor a KJ video, you can do so via fundmyvideo.com. Thanks for watching again and see you next time.